The second thing wrong is that many parts of the New Testament depend upon literalistic interpretation of the Old Testament. For example, the genealogy of Jesus in Luke 3 depends upon Adam being a real person, and it also sets up a specific generational timetable that must be fulfilled. If we're willing to concede that humankind existed before this concrete timetable, the whole thing falls apart. Another example would be the statements in the Pauline corpus regarding patriarchy, regarding the authority of men over women, which are in 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 14, and 1 Timothy 2. They require a literal creation order of Genesis 2, that Adam was created first and Eve was created from Adam. If you don't want to posit that Adam and Eve were literal people, then that falls apart also. Another one would be the Christian doctrine of original sin in Romans 5 also depends upon Adam and Eve being literal people. And in Matthew 24, Jesus refers to a worldwide Noachian flood being an actual event. Another example would be in 2 Corinthians 12. Paul refers to someone which was caught up to the third heaven. Now, this depends upon an ancient understanding of cosmology. So, either Paul was wrong and making stuff up, or I'm not really sure how that could really be accommodated, since you need a literal interpretation of that cosmology in order for these events to have happened. The third thing that I can think of that's wrong with this approach is it creates an unfalsifiability of Scripture. It can basically say whatever the Old Testament and New Testament writers wanted, and you can give the excuse that it made sense for the thought and readership at the time. I'll give you one example. I'm going to read something and get your impression about it. After this, Jesus and his disciples went out into the countryside of Judea. A great multitude had gathered to hear the teacher speak. When the crowd became hungry, a great serpent with many heads proceeded from Jesus' mouth. Jesus slew the serpent and gave its body as food to eat, and the hunger of the crowd was satisfied. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food to the people of the wilderness. Do you accept that as divinely inspired? It's a messianic prophecy. I created that, and I created the fulfillment of prophecy as a conflation of Isaiah 51:9 and Psalm 74:14. And this is precisely an example of the methods which the New Testament writers have used to create fulfillments of prophecy. It's the exact same method. You see, I can create New Testament literature also. The fourth objection that I have to this approach is a simultaneous acceptance and denial of progressive revelation. You're going to accept that the New Testament writers had free license to create new ideas of the Hebrew Bible, but at the same time, you're going to reject reinterpretation of New Testament scripture based upon modern thought. At least evangelicals will do this, particularly regarding the place of women in church and divorce sometimes, and particularly they won't change their interpretation regarding homosexuality. So at some point, they're going to have to acknowledge that this progressive revelation wasn't allowed to happen anymore, and it's entirely arbitrary. And this exact same rationale that God needed to communicate, or it was acceptable for God to communicate in a specific way to a specific people at a specific time. The exact same reasoning can be given to legitimate the existence of the Quran, the Book of Mormon, and the Urantia book, as a few examples of further revelation of God speaking to people as they would be able to understand it at the time. So these are the major objections that I see as critical flaws in this way of approaching the scripture, because it eliminates the possibility that it wasn't divinely inspired.